All right, well, me tīmata tātou. Manawa mai te Māori nuku, manawa mai te Māori rangi ko te Māori kei a tātou, he Māori tipua, ka pakuru mai te pō, tau mai te Māori, haumi e, hui e, taiki e. Tangi apukurana te ngākau e ngā tani whahikurua o te iwi, I pakanga koutou, I te pakanga roa, te pakanga nui mo te iwi Māori, me ngā uri whakahiki. Kua ngū te whitiki o te ki, te puna o te whakaro, mai rā I te rangi Māori e. Kua ea te wāhanga kia koe I hika, kia koutou. Waiho mā tātou o moe moe ia e whakatinana. Kia pā moana, ka hurangi June, tā wira kua ngaro ki te pō, kua hinga ngā tōtara, ngā rākau o te wānui a tāne, moe mai rā I ngā rangatira. Rātou kia rātou, tātou kia tātou. Ka huri ki te hunga ora, nau mai tātou ki tēnei whakawhiti pai kōrero, hoki e pāna ki tēnei taonga, tēnei puka stepping up COVID-19 checkpoints e Rangatiratanga. Ki ngā kaitohi, kia korua a Maria Bargh, I will call Luke Fitzmaurice, nei te mihi, kia koe Carwyn Jones, tēnā koe. Koe a hauhiuri tēnei o ngā whare tapu o ngā puhi, ko Māni Dunlop ahau. Kia ora mai tātou. With the passing of some of our most prominent pou and te ao Māori o te rā Aotearoa, it has of course mobilised our people even more so to, as I said, to whakatinana a rātou moe moe a mā tātou ngā iwi Māori. A very sad, recently but firm reminder of what Moana Jackson dedicated his life to and what legacy we are now tasked to carry on. Realising and practising our mana motuhake a Rangatiratanga, this book is a direct embodiment and record of that in action. And it's my pleasure to talk to the authors and researchers of this beautiful mahi. So, firstly, I'll get you to introduce yourselves. Firstly, Maria, kei a koe.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Maria Bargh tōku ingoa, no te aroa me ngā te awa ahau. Tēnā koutou.
Kia ora. Luke.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Luke Fitzmaurice tōku ingoa, ko te au pauri te iwi. Kia ora.
Kia koe, Carwyn.
Tēnā tātou, ko Carwyn Jones tōku ingoa, he uri ahau no Ngāti Kahungunu ki te Wairoa. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Oh, kia ora mai tātou. So we'll get into the good stuff. Maria, I want to start off with you. Just tell us firstly, what led to this book being created?
Well, really it was Luke's initiative in the beginning. He had a Ngā Pai o Te Māramatanga internship, and that's where most of the research began. So perhaps Luke, in fact, should begin the story.
Okay, kia ora. Yeah, as Maria said, it was originally a research project that was supported by Ngā Pai o Te Māramatanga that was looking into the COVID checkpoints as a case study in Rangatiratanga. So we wanted to talk to some of the people that were involved in the checkpoints, just to get their perspectives on what it involved, what motivated them to do it, and just their kōrero on what it was like and how they saw it folding out or playing out going forward. Partly, I think, the underlying motivation for me to do the project was because we often talk about Rangatiratanga, but at least from my perspective, it's not always a very concrete, we don't always have concrete examples of that, and some do obviously, but it's sometimes this kind of abstract sense of what it might mean, and this felt like this really concrete illustration of Rangatiratanga playing out. And so we wanted to explore that and explore that from the perspective of the people that were involved in the checkpoints.
I guess the other part of it was that when we looked at which checkpoints should we talk about, we of course went back to our own iwi and thought, well, you need to start with where you're from and have those close connections. So the research involved in the book is also a kaupapa Māori sort of research philosophy, if you like, looking at where we had those whanaungatanga connections already, and really excited and proud, obviously, of the people of our own iwi and the other iwi that were involved in these checkpoints, putting in that time, effort, the resources to protect their communities, protect all the people in those communities, Māori and non-Māori, and sharing those stories of the time and the effort, I think is a really important part of this.
Carwyn, I'll just come to you. You wrote the foreword and obviously was key in the creation of this. I've spoken to you many times before about the implementation of Rangatiratanga, many a times. But in terms of and what you laid out in your foreword to this book, I mean, what is so integral about having this and these sorts of examples on record?
Well, I think partly it's what Luke touched on already, was to point out that these, you've got here some really practical examples, some case studies of people exercising rangatiratanga, but also that bringing them together in the way that Maria and Luke have done, and putting them within a framework of thinking about the exercise of rangatiratanga, we can really start to see what we can learn from these examples about the ways in which you exercise rangatiratanga, and what we can learn about the relationships between what we are getting used to talking about in terms of the rangatiratanga sphere and the kāwanatanga sphere in that context as well. So it's that bringing those practical examples together that then allow you to see that bigger conceptual picture about the nature of rangatiratanga.
There were 4 main questions that started this research, or how they've been centered on this book. So it was around, that first question around the motivation. So when you started talking to those particular case studies, were the motivations all the same, or did it differ through the regions, or did it differ based on how that iwi or how that hapū or how that community and what relationships they already had with authorities during that time? Maria or Luke, kia korua.
I think what I found really interesting is that there was a similar kind of theme of rangatiratanga running through all of them and of people's descriptions and discussions of them, but they all used different words and had different kōrero around what it was for them. So some explicitly called it a rangatiratanga thing, others would say mana motuhake instead, others. One I said, was this about rangatiratanga? And he was like, oh, nah, to me, that's kind of protesty. To me, it was just kind of doing it and getting out. And like, he wasn't against protesting or anything, but he was just like, nah, it's just getting out and doing it and like getting it done. And there was still, though, this underlying tikanga of rangatiratanga. So one of the things that we kind of took from that is that rangatiratanga can look different in different places and can use different terminology and all sorts of those things, but there's always this underlying tikanga in the case studies that we looked at anyway, that they all had that in common.
And a key part of it was talking to their whether it was their whānau, hapū and iwi. So this rangatiratanga was expressed at those different levels, but a key aspect of the tikanga was not individuals just working on their own, but actually it was a collective effort. So whether that was a whānau, hapū or iwi collective effort, they were doing it together. And there was discussion about what was going to happen, how they were going to go about it, where the resources were going to come from. So I think that's also that collective element of our tikanga is a key part of what was evidenced here.
One of the key quotes that is short, but I think to the point, and it just says, we felt we had a right as a people to act. So it's an interesting take on the sense of that concept of rangatiratanga, and I have to commend you for summarising it in such a short chapter. I was thoroughly impressed. But in terms of kind of developing and like you say, for a lot of the case studies and a lot of the communities didn't realise that that's what actually what they were doing, yeah?
Yeah, I think that's... I wouldn't want to say didn't realise in terms of kind of taking away the agency or the kind of proactiveness of what they were doing, because there was very much that shared sense of, we've got a right to act here, we're going to go out and do it. They didn't all put the same framework on it, and they didn't all kind of view it as either explicitly political or explicitly like a tatiriti thing. So in that sense, definitely. but there was always this kind of active choice to go out and serve their people as well. So they did and they didn't, if that makes sense.
Mm.
And I guess, isn't that a key feature really of Māori political entities, just going about their business, Māori people being Māori, not having to, bounce it off the Crown or colonisation or any other kind of point of reference, but actually Māori get to be just Māori, doing our own thing, our political entities, enacting their rangatiratanga, practising tikanga Māori in our own ways, independently in many ways. And I think when we're thinking about constitutional transformation, to me, this is sort of what we're heading towards, is further recognition of the ways in which whānau, hapū and iwi are already living these things and doing these things, whether it's protecting the environment in reforestation and pest control matters, or getting out there on the roadside and looking after their communities by providing information or restricting flow of traffic, as this might be. But Māori are doing those things and enacting and living that rangatiratanga as well.
Mm.
That was one of the things that was really striking to me in reading the book, was that the motivation for these exercises of tino rangatiratanga was not to say, oh, we want to assert our authority or we want to pick a fight with the government or anyone else, but rather to keep people safe. It was born out of exercising those duties and obligations that come along with rangatiratanga, and saying, well, we've got a right to look after our people, to protect our people and our communities in the way that we see fit, and in a way we don't see government exercising its authority to do here, so we'll take that on ourselves. We'll exercise that responsibility. And as Maria's talked about, consistently with tikanga Māori, it's very much a collective obligation and duty that comes with that exercise of rangatiratanga.
You went straight to constitutional transformation there, Maria, so we'll get there. But I do want to touch on the, I guess, the contentious aspect that with anything, with tino rangatiratanga and that self-determination, there's always someone or a small sector of society that may have a problem with it. And it was used as a little bit of a political football during that lockdown, and which is predictable, unfortunately. However, did you find, though, in terms of, based on all of the study, all of the research that you've all done around this particular issue, or issue is probably not the right word, kaupapa, did you find, in terms of the uptake from the Crown and from the authorities like the police, that they were actually led by Māori and led by communities rather than the other way around, in which we usually see? Was that quite prominent?
Yeah, I think that was. And I think it was a unique circumstance for that to occur, given that it was so early in COVID and it was this huge thing that everyone was still getting to grips with. And the Crown is set up in such a way that I think they go, oh, well, what's the process here? What legislation might we need to pass? What might the policy need to be on this? And how did the different agencies need to work together? And some of that has a place, but actually what we saw was a community-led, and it's partly why we called the book Stepping Up. They were so much more able to just go, right, here's something that is a threat to our safety and our collective well-being. Here's what we can do about it. We're going to go out and do it. And they thought that through a lot, and they all had their own processes for making that decision. But those local hapū, whānau and iwi level decisions were so much quicker than the police, for example, in being able to make a decision that the Crown ultimately came to decide was good as well. And I think another thing about some of the criticism of it is that it's so misperceived on what the motivation was and what the real issue was. Like, none of the whānau that we talked to were like, right, we want to shut down a road. Let's go and shut down a road. Rangatiratanga is not about roads. It was about safety and health and well-being in the face of this big threat. So the kind of exercise of Rangatiratanga we need to think about it in terms of the actual issue, because no one's out there claiming that we can shut down roads all the time whenever we want. It wasn't about that. It was about the cause and the harm and the need to do something in response. And we saw that the whānau we talked to were far better placed than the Crown to do that quickly and in a way that needed to be done in the circumstances.
And I think kind of in some ways, ironically, resourcing, even though it was clearly a massive issue, it wasn't the thing that held them up. The drive and the motivation to protect the people and the whenua, of course, by extension, overrode, do we actually have the money to, get the portaloo or whatever it is. Actually, people just went ahead, and these are people who very often, have few resources. So we're kind of dragging these together, but that didn't stop them. It was and I think that's why they're really these unsung heroes, because they put their effort in, put their own personal resources in, and those of their communities, their time, their effort, their tears into this. And they weren't held up at the beginning by that. It was the, love of the community and the care for the community that overrode those things. So I think, that's something that we all should remember, and something that, of course, as Luke said, bogs down other government agencies, which start with, where do we get the resourcing from, rather than that care for the community.
Yeah, before we go into kind of what each community took away from that, and how they, how these sorts of things can be implemented in the future. But in terms of, of course we want Māori at the helm in a crisis. I mean, we're pretty good at it. So I want my aunties running the show. But in terms of, and it was touched on in the book around that link in with, it went further than roadblocks. It went further than the checkpoints, because it wasn't, and also I want to make clear that, and what was made clear, that it was about the communities. It wasn't just, we're going to look after Māori. It's about looking after everyone, and how when you apply to Rangatiratanga and when it's in action, it can work for all of Aotearoa. Just make that really clear. So in terms of how these checkpoints also fed into those other community responses, when we saw the vaccination rollout wasn't working, when we saw Māori weren't getting the resources or the information from the ministry and from the Crown, that it was Māori who, again, front-footed it and said, okay, no, was there direct correlations between the two?
Well, I think some of that's about trust as well. Trusting that Māori initiatives work, trusting that Māori can do this. And with the sort of debacle around the vaccine rollout, I think some of that came back to that Māori providers weren't being trusted when actually they were fully capable, probably still not properly resourced, but could totally do it. So
I think one of the frustrating things in how things have played out subsequently is seeing how some of the lessons of the checkpoints haven't been learnt by the Crown. And in the way we talked before about how it almost took them by surprise because everything was happening so fast, and the whānau we talked to were quicker to respond. It was almost like once the Crown did catch up, then they had forgotten some of the lessons of what made the checkpoints successful, and they'd seen these groups take this initiative to protect their communities, and they ended up trusting them to do that and partnering with them. And then when it came to the next waves and the vaccine rollout, all that trust, some of it was gone again, and there was a little bit still there, and some of those things have kind of happened in bits over time. But it felt like there was this moment where it was shown how successful this could be, and some of the lessons of that have been learned, but some of them feel like they've been lost, and that's frustrating in a way.
Carwyn, I want to come to you on this. In terms of, had this happened 5 or even 10 years ago, and Māori, led a similar response in terms of checkpoints, do you think it would have had the same uptake, potentially under another government? Would it have been the same?
Well, I mean, I do think the police commissioner was quite responsible in the way that he engaged with this issue, the way in which he made sure to recognise that these roadblocks were being set up by Māori for their communities under their own authority. He refused to get drawn into conversations about, are the police giving them the authority to do that? And he didn't want to go there, and quite rightly so, because these were actions that were drawing on Māori authority. They were drawing on Rangatiratanga to be able to work effectively. And yes, there was communication and collaboration, of course, in cooperation with the police and with government. But I do think that the government does need to be ready to respond to that in order to act as good tiriti partners and to make space for that rangatiratanga to work most effectively. And I think that's perhaps where we saw with the example of the vaccine rollout, that instead of allowing rangatiratanga to occupy that space, that obstacles were put in the way by not, releasing data and those kinds of things. So there is an obligation on government to act as a good tiriti partner here. And I think the checkpoints are a good example perhaps of that. But we've seen through through other aspects of the pandemic that the government hasn't always acted in that way.
I guess more to that, what I was kind of also getting at was, do you think that it would have, although there was, like you say, the police commissioner, there was definitely some grey area conversations and comments made on the police's behalf, which worked in the checkpoint's favour, of course, to some extent. However, do you think that there was some, like we've talked about the contentious issue, but we've also heard where there was also positive responses from the communities, from non-Māori, around how they felt really safe with having these in place. Do you think that we're moving in a direction in which that wouldn't have had the same positive response, say 5 or 10 years ago?
I think we're certainly moving into society is coming to grips with thinking about te ao Māori and the exercise of rangatiratanga and the ways in which that doesn't need to be seen as something scary. And there's still a lot of work to be done there, but certainly it's examples like the checkpoints, I think, that help to build that story, that help to demonstrate that these are really beneficial activities that can take place, and that it really works to be able to draw on different sources of authority, to draw on different tools to be able to address problems that are common to us all. And so seeing the effectiveness of these checkpoints in keeping communities safe, and as you pointed out, not only Māori, but keeping all of us safe there, that helps people to see that rangatiratanga can coexist with kāwanatanga. That's what Te Tiriti talks about, and that there are real benefits to enhancing that relationship.
Maria, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I was wondering if you were trying to angle at a different government in terms of a national-led government would have been different. And in that case, I don't think so. I mean, when parties are in opposition, they're always going to be saying things to lift their profile and potentially be divisive. I think when they're in government, they tend to settle down and do things in a very similar way. But I think the important point is what Carwyn was talking about in terms of the growing momentum and shift that we see in society. We see it in the university with the students, real keenness to learn about these things. Again, we have politicians trying to be divisive, but actually these examples show that working together can, look after communities in different ways.
Do you think that divisiveness, that, like you say, will always be, it's always going to be used in that way, but do you think that it's not landing in the same way as it may have used to?
Yeah, I don't think it's landing in the same way. I think that people are shrugging it off a little bit more now, and we can see it even in the cartoons and the newspaper. You know, there's a bit more of awareness when things are dog whistling and trying to, politicians trying to resurrect careers or whatever it is. People say, actually, it's not what I'm seeing over here. You know, I've been hanging out with this community group, and we've been trapping together and reforesting, and we bring our different skills together, and that's really working. Or, you know, at the roadside checkpoints, we saw how they looked after our communities. So I think, you know, raising the visibility of these sorts of examples helps to proliferate them. And I think that's why this research, actually, if I do say so, is so important, to actually keep raising the visibility of these stories and occasions and cases where Māori, non-Māori, tauiwi, with the Rangatiratanga sphere and the Carwynatanga sphere are doing things together and looking after people and the whenua.
Mm. Before we go into kind of those what has been learned and how, you know, looking ahead, I do want to ask all of you kind of a key takeaway, like an anecdote from the book that has really stuck with you, Luke.
Probably the commitment of all of the people we spoke to the kaupapa, and in particular, one story that really stuck with me was someone who spent every day of level 4 on the front line, and this was up north, and his whole family was on the other side of the checkpoint, and they were separated for that entire time, because that was what would keep them each safest. And he still chose to be there every day, working on the road, helping to make it happen. And that was pretty true of all of the people we spoke to, but just so exemplified that for me, that there was this deep personal cost for some of them, but that was worth it, because collectively that was what was going to keep us safe. And so they didn't even give it a second thought that was what they would do.
Oh, beautiful. Like Maria said, unsung heroes. Maria, for you?
To me, it's the planning, that actually there were rosters, there were like a million emails and phone calls and things, and some of those were shared with us. You know, it was detailed planning. It wasn't, I mean, it was rapid, and, you know, people were out there quickly and people were mobilized quickly, but it was also planned. And then there was, you know, there were lots of people that weren't necessarily out in the rain and the wind or the hot sun, actually on the checkpoint, but they were mobilizing behind the scenes, contacting their relations, or, you know, getting signs, getting cones for the road, you know, all of the kind of logistics and planning that went into it. I think, again, you know, that's so much time and energy, and to me that's really big. It's not just, you don't just whip these things up by walking out and standing on the street. You know, you need the road sign there, the stop go sign, you need the cones, and you need people to bring you know, mobilize. And I guess, again, I think of the big hui that we have at marae or tangihanga, and the way in which, again, our marae and our communities know how to do things like that. We know how to mobilise when someone passes away and you suddenly need luxury loos and to be able to cater for, you know, 3,000 people over 3 days. And so there's a depth of ability and capacity within Māori communities. It's not very well resourced, and that's the, you know, that's the other side of it. Just because Māori do it on the smell of an oily rag doesn't mean it should be like that. There should be resourcing in there to support it. But you know, that skill and that talent and that organisation and planning is there. I think that's important to keep in mind too.
Some of that planning too was collective across different iwi as well. And so we spoke to some people that after the first couple of checkpoints had been set up and they had made their own decision to do something similar, they'd got a risk register and a roster and templates and like all these admin-y things that helped make them happen. So it wasn't just that each whānau and hapū had the capacity to do that themselves, which they did. There was also this cooperation across the motu of things that you wouldn't necessarily expect, that are the forms and the background admin and stuff, but that was part of the wider collective of what made it happen.
I don't have a particular example, but one of the kind of themes that really stood out to me looking at all these case studies was, and we've touched on it before, but thinking about the way in which this was an exercise of rangatiratanga in accordance with tikanga. And that might not necessarily have been the kind of at the forefront of people's minds, but it seems to have very naturally been the way in which people respond in accordance with tikanga. And so, for example, tino rangatiratanga is not about everyone being able to do whatever it is that they want. It's about a community being able to determine a response as a collective and for a particular purpose. So for the purpose of discharging those obligations and those duties of rangatiratanga. And so that's really stood out to me that just as people quite naturally respond to the situation, their instinct is to exercise that rangatiratanga in a way that I see as being very entirely consistent with tikanga Māori.
Again, we have touched on this, but in terms of past Crown Māori relationships and now moving forward, how do you think this real tangible example, as we've explored, how is this going to kind of set a foundation for future Crown Māori relationships and putting things in action from here?
One thing I think for me is that it challenged the assumption that the Crown seems to sometimes have, that they are the ones to initiate those relationships, that Te Tiriti partnership can look like, and perhaps should look like, the hapū and iwi exercising rangatiratanga and inviting those partnerships themselves. So here's the issue, here's what we're going to do about it, here's how we could partner together for it. That is not typically how partnership is perceived, at least by policymakers or politicians in my experience. But to me, it makes perfect sense of how it should happen more often than not, probably.
I think the other key aspect, we sort of mentioned it earlier, is memory. And so for the Crown to remember, that Māori did this well and it worked and it was okay. And so I think, having to remind the Crown is probably going to be the thing about Māori capacity, and that, this is possible, it has been done before. This wasn't the first, expression of rangatiratanga that was successful. There are many others. So I think that's a key part of it as well. Māori, of course, remember these things and tend to have a long sense of all the different cases and examples back through our history. So with children learning, about our history, that's going to add some good points to this. But I think within government agencies, it's important that they, have databases of these things and remember.
And both of those aspects that Luke and Maria talked about, I think, also speak to the Crown needing to get its head around the idea that it doesn't have all the answers. So not only is it, it's not the one that always needs to initiate things, but it also needs to respond in a way which demonstrates trust and recognition of Māori capability and Māori rangatiratanga as well. And as Maria has talked about, these examples, are things that you can point to and say, look, remember how this worked, remember how Māori took up this space, and it was really effective and beneficial for everyone.
Like Luke, you said, maybe a little bit of a memory loss, and some it's kind of fading already, because I guess I can't believe it's been 2 years since we were there. Because all this research was done in 2020, yeah?
Yeah, so it was all in the second half of 2020, all focused on that initial first lockdown.
Awesome. When we talk about tino rangatiratanga and we co-governance and power sharing and all of these kind of buzzwords like that we're hearing more of recently, and I won't directly attribute, but in terms of those concepts, is this just an awesome example? So excuse all my post-it notes, it's me trying to take good notes. Is this just a really good and clear example of how people just can no longer be worried about what that looks like? Because like you said, and you touched on it really early on, Luke, around, some people that you spoke to, they were talking about how, that's associated with a protest movement or whatever. Like the radicalization of what Tino Rangatiratanga is associated with is no longer how it's being perceived in the public sphere, do you think?
I think that's definitely increasingly the case. And I think part of what we're trying to do and communicate is that this isn't as scary as people who might be doing a bit of fear-mongering about co-governance, for example, are trying to make it out to be. I think when you ask people about co-governance, they're like, oh, I'm not sure about that. But if you ask them about would they like their lake to be cleaner, they definitely would like their lake to be cleaner, and they definitely would like their rural community to be protected from a deadly disease, and they definitely would like a iwi social service health provider that can do things more effectively than other health providers have in the past to do that. So making it real, and I certainly wouldn't shy away from words like co-governance or rangatiratanga, because I think they're an important part of the conversation, but actually fleshing that out a bit more. People are less scared of the actual examples because more often than not, they're really positive and they have the potential to be positive. And so we need to keep talking about co-governance and rangatiratanga, but we actually need to be making that real as well in terms of the public sphere. I think for Māori, we already know that it's real and we can already articulate that, but part of that broader conversation is how making it concrete and just bringing it home to people that this probably isn't as scary as you think.
And Maria, in the conclusion of the book, the lessons are laid out really clearly, but I think to speak more to that you both say the implications far beyond the specific, these lessons may have implications far beyond the specific context of the checkpoints and the areas of, and then you go on to less social policy, environmental management, education, law, and a range of other fields. Can you just elaborate on that and how that can really link in to all of those aspects and those sectors that you've laid out?
Well, I think it connects with what Luke was just talking about, that when people can see at a very local level, they know their neighbours or the people in their community, and they're all working on a project, say, protecting the lake and the water quality and trying to kill the catfish or whatever it might be, that those local projects help to reduce the fear about the idea of working together with other communities. And I think people are, when they think about what's, say, looking after their lake, I think they're more readily able to accept that they personally don't have all the answers. They might not have all the skills and solutions to this complicated problem. So they'll need to work with others and draw on others' strengths and other knowledge systems. And I think actually the lake being from Te Aroha, of course, the lakes is a good example, and Te Aroha has some amazing, solutions.
Who's that? Not the north, I don't know about it.
And so there are different methods around that. And so I think the idea of bringing together different strengths and getting to know other people really kind of demystifies it. Demystifies some idea of co-governance that somehow sits out there, but actually if it's about ourselves and our communities and looking after the things we care about and drawing on our different strengths for the benefit of us all, to me that's sort of what it's about.
I think we're nearing the end of our time. I'm just trying to keep an eye on the time. I feel like we've covered all the key points. Was there anything that any of you think that we haven't even touched or gone near, or that you want to elaborate on?
Possibly just the another thing that really stuck with me was when we set up the project, we talked about iwi checkpoints, because that was what was in the media most often, and that was the kind of buzzword of people what they knew. Yeah, it's all your guys' fault. And one of the very first things that we found was that iwi checkpoints was not an accurate description for what was happening, and it was sometimes the case. And some of the case studies we looked at were iwi, some were multiple iwi working together, some were purely hapū, and some were just whānau-led collaborations with a local group doing it for themselves. And so none of those were anti-iwi or anything like that, but those expressions of rangatiratanga did take different forms everywhere, and that's really good. And that, to me, and what I took from it, and probably the thing that I learned most and most changed my perspective, is that is pretty core to what rangatiratanga means, is that whānau-led, hapū-led, and sometimes iwi-led, but often the Crown assumes iwi is the only group that matters. Sometimes they will only deal with multiple iwi gathered together, but actually a Māori-led and a Māori-defined version of rangatiratanga has to have space for all those groups in between, and that's what it looks like to exercise that.
And actually, the government can cope with that when it looks externally at other countries. It can interact with different states, have background briefings on what they have going on, and work out their particular political system and deal with different states in the world appropriately. And I think rather than trying to force Māori into a very constrained framework or ideal that the Crown has, that a better avenue for them is to accept this diversity of expression that Māori have, and accept hapū and iwi in their different forms, usually based on what Carwyn's called Māori constitutional traditions and tikanga Māori, but with slightly different expressions, but to accept that in the same way that they accept different political systems of states internationally. That might be a guide for them.
Carwyn, did you want to add to that?
Well, look, I think it's really sum things up quite nicely, and I don't know that I have much more to add. That point about thinking about how to have Māori initiate and define the rangatiratanga space is really important, and it does make it easier for kāwanatanga to engage, and if the Crown could get its head around that, rather than trying to control the conversation and define who it talks to, then I think it would quickly see the real benefits of that.
Mm. I'm sure this may be a dumb question, but does someone have, I would really love someone to read out a quote that if you've got the book near you in arm's reach. Cool. Particularly, I just think it's a really awesome way to sum everything up, and it's be nice to give everyone a little bit of a taster of what's in here too. It's on page 62. I feel like we're doing a play reading, table read. If I take you to the bottom of page 62, that quote there, the checkpoints have had an ongoing impact. Who would like to read that out? Sorry, this is not how I pictured it. I just thought it'd be a nice, profound way, and now I'm just sounding like a teacher. So aroha everyone.
I can do that.
Cool, Luke.
I've been told to do that. I can understand the subject set.
You get a chocolate fish.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I really like this quote as well. Standing on the boundaries for your hapū, your ancestral boundaries for your hapū, taking that stand to look after your people and your lands, there's something quite innate about that. When you physically stand on the front line to look after your mana whenua and your mana motuhaki, there's something quite visceral about it that doesn't quite leave you. I'll always remember it for that.
Atahua. And on that note, nei te mihi kia koutou, e nei te mihi kia koutou e mātaki mai. Kia ora.